Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter Meusberger, for the opportunity for presenting the International Building Exhibition. Together with Karl Zillich, I will speak about something that we call research by design. Myself, being a practitioner and academic at the same, I've studied urban design and urban planning in Berlin, and since 1980 I'm working in several offices in different towns, and since 1998 I'm teaching at the University of Hanover design. And actually I'm the director of the International Building Exhibition in Heidelberg. Before I give you a short introduction into the German, I will say, success story of IBAS, let me state that the state of architecture has changed over the last 100 years. If we talk today about a building exhibition, architects are always concerned with more than facades of buildings. The section here reminds us how complex a building is, not only in terms of construction, but also in organization. We believe that the modernistic paradigm of separating function is out of date. It does not need to be a skyscraper to resemble the qualities of a city, or, as we claim, knowledge-based urbanism. But let's look back. Already, the first Ebar, according to architecture historian Werner Dürth, was more. The first Ebar was more than thinking about Art Nouveau buildings. The artist colony in Darmstadt in 1901 was organized to remind of the fact that the art, together with the craft, a quality assurance must be in the age of the industrialization. From the door handle up to the town planning, so there was the motto of this first building exhibition. A quarter century later in Stuttgart, modernism could present its mission. And that was not only about a later called international style, but also about new construction methods and especially its costs. New ways of living were presented, addressing the shortage in housing and spatial qualities possible for less money. Then, I think the famous IBAS in Berlin. First, the so-called Interbau 1957, housing again, under the modernist paradigm, a tower in the park typology that is still attractive today. Of course, because of its central location. What followed was the wrong locations of these typologies all over the world, at the edges of the city, where they most often failed. The direct response, and that's interesting, to that was 30 years later, the Ebar, again in Berlin, 1984, 1987, one called critical reconstruction, where new housing was adapted in the existing city fabric. In Kreuzberg, at the time, a part of Berlin, at that time, many voids of the Second World War were still there. Some were filled, some transformed. This exhibition applies so far as an answer to the ignorance and self-centeredness of the post-war modern age. Back in the city center, and the careful deal with the found were the aims of this exhibition. That discourse is still with us today because it reorganized the relation between citizens, professionals, and politicians. Instead of continuing large-scale demolition of old housing stock, its qualities were rediscovered and ways of participation were established. A similar strategy on a completely different scale was introduced in the Emscher region by an Ebar in the late 1990s. In and on the ruins of deindustrialized landscape, the idea of a regional park was developed and implemented. converting brown fields into industrial parks or living quarters and giving the declining region a new future. New future was also the driving agenda for the latest large IBA that presented its result last year in Hamburg and Wilhelmsburg. A deprived part of the city got full attention for 7 years to improve the housing stock, create new educational facilities for all generations. Also, the issue of climate change was addressed. Those were some of the important old IBAs, always well funded with public money and addressing immediate challenges. That's radically different in Heidelberg. Still, the city is taking the IBA path to address possible urban and architectural responses to the so-called knowledge-based urbanism. To protect the high-class standards of international buildings exhibitions in Germany, a federal commission to whom I belonged was constituted about 5-6 years ago. This commission formulated standards for which an IBA must be enough. The first principle is the basis of good architecture and good planning. Still, it needs to be stressed because markets and also administrations tend to be very conservative. The issue of scale, the second standard. As mentioned in my introduction, one should not design a house without looking at its surrounding. Third, again, the context, now from a different perspective, making clear that an IBA is not about flying in great design or solutions that have no relation to the locality and its people. Here, the different aspects of integration, of design thinking, one could call it, are listed, and those need to be pushed towards new concepts. Fifth, we know that not just projects but also processes need to be designed. And this is a real challenge, as too often the process kills the design ambition and its spatial qualities. The eye is important too. Still, the will to challenge one's conceptions and establish solutions need input from the outside. Seventh, all these can only be achieved when certain administrative and political processes are bypassed. Too many procedures make our societies fearful of experiments. In this way, an IBA is research by design, not a hard science, of course, but still risks are taken to open up the possibilities. That is why IBAs are organized as limited liability corporation. It gives us some freedom, but we also need external money to be successful. Up to now, we are funded 100% by the city of Heidelberg. So the board of administrators has mostly local politicians on it. And we had the opportunity to assemble an interdisciplinary board of trustees, German-speaking, but with international reputation. All external ones are tenured professors, to be precise. They come from business, history of arts, landscape architecture, urban ethnology, urban design, sociology, arts, natural science, pedagogic, and architecture. They help us navigate between the broad issues we address and the concrete solutions we need. So our structure works since 1.5 years. Now we are in a demanding phase of finding the right projects to work with on build innovation regarding the knowledge-based society.
So that was the overview by Michael, and I'm going to jump into the concrete agenda in Heidelberg. Now, we've mentioned it a couple of times already today, that Heidelberg has a very long history in the interrelation of town and gown, and I will elaborate on how that actually also brings in the question of what's the third party, and that would be the planner, the architect, that was already mentioned today too. So here you have the city of Heidelberg and its settled areas, which is important because all other IBAs usually had certain areas, neighborhoods, where they would work on, and we have the whole city as an agenda. And here you also see the university and research institutions that Peter Meusberger also mentioned, the other ones. We are now somewhere here, and these are the other research institutes that Peter Meusberger mentioned. And you also have the sites of military conversion, which could in parts become sites for the IBA, but most important, you have the different phases of the university, which I will now go into. You have the origins and mansions, then the first planned university buildings, then the jump across the river to Neuenheimer Feld, the modernist paradigm, and now back transforming old hospital buildings to Berkheim. And that's the different scales of university development that this IBA will work with. So you have the cliché that we have already seen in the central area, but not homogeneous perspective, but also from different centuries, buildings which represent their period. You have the hospitals who are transformed now to educational buildings. I think it's important to stress that the discussion should also be of why in architectural history prisons, military buildings, hospitals, and schools had one typology, and how we actually get out of that is the big question of how our future working environments should evolve. That will be one question that we also address as an IBA. And then you have the Neuenheimer Feld, started after the Second World War, but already planned before that when the Botanical Garden moved out there, and now it's an agglomeration of many different monofunctional, mostly buildings, which form a big cluster of the university, not far from the old town, but still without public space that one could call urban. And there one of the IBA questions is how much urbanism does this area need? We discussed already how different disciplines have different agendas for their settings, and that will be one of the challenges for the university and the IBA relation, how actually these different sites have different potentials to still work on innovation in terms of the spatial environment. And here focusing, zooming in into Neuenheimer Feld, we have high quality of architecture being presented, but very disconnected from any urban public space or public space that actually enhances interaction between these disciplines, these different typologies. And the question is, how does actually the urban scale function in places like this? But it's very important to us and also to the city of Heidelberg, the politicians who voted almost anonymously to implement an IBA, that it's not just about the academic world, but also about education in the broader sense. So here's a map which also shows you secondary, elementary schools, and even some kindergartens to show how much the city of Heidelberg is infiltrated by education. Each neighborhood has some facilities, and our goal is actually that by 2022, when we want to close our experiment, in every part of town, not only where the university and research and higher education is, but also in the other parts of town, there should be something that represents the knowledge-based society and brings together different kinds of people, of our citizens. For that, we have elaborated different formats. You heard already that we have only been working for 1.5 years by now, and we have 8 or 9 more years to go. But we really want to make it a broad movement, if you want to call it that way. And so we have some kind of zoology, to quote Lucius Burke, the sociologist, who said that we need to be on site to really understand what we are doing. And so we actually go to different neighborhoods where we talk to the citizens, but also bring in experts, because we really believe in the similarity, simultaneity between bottom-up and top-down. So we believe we are experts which are new in Heidelberg. We both moved here 1.5 years ago. So that's important to have expertise from the outside, but we also need the expertise from within the neighborhood. And there we walk by educational facilities of all kinds and discuss on-site basically the potentials for a future transformation or whether it's working well. And then this diagram focusing on a school actually shows how it's not just about the buildings, but really about the context in a spatial term, but also in a social term. So here this is an example of the school, where you have a school and the classroom and the teacher, but also then the broader environment that the pupils are engaged in, and of course the whole city, where the whole learning environment and education in the knowledge-based society is not restricted to hierarchies or vertical separations, but should be thought in an integrative way also in terms of planning. For that, we bring in a lot of expertise from the outside in our IBA labs, where examples are discussed and tested for their equivalent in Heidelberg. And just two from the Netherlands we had last year. One is also transforming old buildings, not the very old ones which you showed, but lab buildings in Eindhoven here for a new library and mathematics building. So heritage is also something for the modernist period to consider. And you have the steep densification of functions, also maybe driven by an economic paradigm, where you have 3 kindergartens, 2 public schools, 60 elderly homes, and other community facilities in one building, which then becomes a crown for the neighborhood. So those are examples that we are testing basically on how much Heidelberg can learn from them. Then we have student workshops, the IBA Academy, where we bring in expertise from abroad to really bring images which are radical in some way to Heidelberg, which doesn't have a planning school, and can use some more visionary thinking in terms of spatial ideas. Here we had the Burke Im West area, where the question was, how does this intersection of different pathways for the different campuses can be transformed to an urban setting which does not segregate but integrate? Or here a school district of different schools, where open space design can connect them, something that one could imagine being transformed to the Neuenheimer Feld. And in this room, we had a couple months ago the First Ebar Summit. We are working on establishing a group of cities and institutions who should discuss the town and gown and the administration and planning relationships between each other. So we have our rector, our Minister of Culture, which was mentioned, who wants to cut 10%, then our mayor and some professors from across the world who were in this room to find a common language, just like we do now, but not only in the academic term, to say so, but really between the university administrators, the academicians, the politics, the local politics, the land politics, and the planners and architects. And that's something where we also have a long-term perspective to establish a network where we can test what can be done out of that. We had from Stanford and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Cambridge, England, people here, or from Delft and Krakow from Poland. A very interesting discussion between these different styles of thinking between politics, administrations, and academia. One issue that was presented was this Rosa Island discussion in New York, where one can really see how the different branding also of educational spaces are shifting, and how the integration of different areas of housing, public spaces, and highly specialized academic spaces can be thought of today, but also, of course, how it is used as a marketing tool. But Heidelberg, of course, is not a knowledge hub like New York or Berlin, but is a knowledge pearl, and that's why we really have a special case also in Heidelberg to work on. And I think this diagram from the inclusion debate, considering schooling, which is a big issue in Germany now, also applies actually to the discussions we had already today, how much segregation or differentiation, individuality we need, and how much inclusion can we actually afford. And the question of what's urban and what's tradition in academia is one that we want to address with experiments looking into many different discourses, also one like the one with Richard Florida. How does creative milieus work? Can they be expanded to the academic world? Which disciplines actually are interested in this overlap and the spontaneous interaction in public spaces or urban spaces? And all these things are on a test site here in Heidelberg, a diagram showing how regular planning tools like a competition or zoning have to be overlap with participation processes, again, bottom up and top down at the same time. We have a call for projects where we have 55 ideas from the citizens coming into our office, and our Board of Trustees had voted 23 to be test candidates. And there we now are looking into how actually these outside-in ideas can be established in the Heidelberg context. Just examples from elsewhere to give you an idea of what we are talking about. A library, of course, the typology also by Leon Krier, which you mentioned, would be, of course, that it still has the temple as a front entrance, and libraries usually have one entrance. And here in Holland, then we have a library which has actually economic store spaces around, so that a library doesn't have 3 dead sides. And that's an issue, like how do actually educational buildings, which are often large scale, work in an urban context. Or here in Barcelona, the stacking of kindergartens, community centers, and libraries to, again, ask the question, how can we bring together people also of academia, non-academia, to interrogate each other. Or here from New York, the question of a new building for the economies, which also is opening up to sociology and different disciplines. So this interdisciplinary approach is represented in this building, and public spaces going up here. It's built on a site which is eminent domain, where the state of New York took it from the owners to give Columbia space for expansion, a very tricky process of the civic value that we discussed earlier. And here just the neighborhood idea that we also in Heidelberg or in Germany in total have to discuss, how state universities in Germany, which have the 90% majority here, don't have a tradition in contributing to their direct neighborhoods. It's rising, but still there's a big issue of how actually academia can connect more to the local communities, which support its needs, but also which it needs for the quality of life aspects, that in the competition between different elite universities around the globe, it's not only the professor who wants to be attracted with good benefits, but also its family. And so in Heidelberg is also the case that the university sees that it has to work harder with the city together in making Heidelberg an interesting place for knowledge workers, not only in academic buildings and quarters, but also in the city as a whole. That's why we also address schools and other educational facilities. To steer all this, the Board of Trustees together with us came up with 5 criteria that we are testing the proposed projects on. One is public relevance. So it means that the building projects cannot be self-referential. They have to give something back to the community to be an IBA project. They have to invite extra competence, that the elite, the excellence status that the University of Heidelberg has, and this high reputation the city has for tourists is also triggering down into the everyday life of each neighborhood. Then we ask for prototypes. That's the issue of why an IBA takes 10 years and why it's really a research by design, that we really think that also architecture is in that way a science where you need to take risks. And the previous IBAs that Michael has presented show that it actually is something that's worth the effort. And of course, the structural impact is the outside, again, of the buildings and interventions that we are doing. They all have to be carefully rooted in the neighborhoods. That's why bottom-up is also part of our agenda. And in the end, the big question I think that we discuss during these days here is actually how much heterogeneity we actually want for our education, for our knowledge-based society, and how much architecture and spatial arrangement can contribute to that. So in the end, it's about very sectional thinking about the city again, not just the facades or not just the statistics, but really the complexity of it all. And that's why we have this 10-year period with a small funding by the city for now. But the IBA in Hamburg actually had a return of investment of 1 to 7. So for each euro that the public gave to the IBA in Hamburg, 7 euros were invested by the private sector. It will be a little bit tricky with a knowledge subject here in Heidelberg, because of course housing is more a market than academia or education. But still we are positive that we will find also outside money and by the state and by the federal government to invest in the experiment in Heidelberg for knowledge-based urbanism. Thank you.